One of the things that's coming in fast were the 3 Russian fighter jets that came from Russia and came over Estonian airspace. This was intentional. According to the foreign minister of Estonia, it was brazen, just what we know. 3 Russian MiG-31 Foxhound fighter jets busted into Estonian airspace near Vaindaloo Island. Now, I'll go over to the map here and show you Vaindaloo Island. That's the red dot right there. And so you can see Estonia here, and this is Russia. Russia and Estonia share a border, but Vaindaloo Island is all the way over here, this little tiny island right there. That's where these fighter jets flew to. Now, they flew around in circles out there for 12 minutes. Why 12 minutes? Because it took 12 minutes for NATO's response. So what we saw was Italian fighter jets from NATO. They were stationed in Estonia, and they got and flew out to intercept these jets. And when they did, the Russian jets turned around and went back home. But what we know about the Russian MiG-31s is that they were armed with hypersonic missiles. And a couple other things that we know is that they were not squawking any frequency. They had their transponders turned off, and that's a huge no-no all the time. They also had not filed a flight plan, so they're essentially flying around blind in Estonian airspace where there are civilian jets flying around, coming and going. There's always a chance when something like that happens that you could have a mid-air collision, that there could be a passenger jet coming in and could not see this fighter jet and they could crash into one another. That's why you're supposed to be squawking a frequency to let the other aircraft in the area know, and to let ATC know, air traffic control, that you're in the area. So these guys intentionally crossed over, flew around in circles in Estonian airspace until they saw Italian fighter jets coming up to meet them, and then they turned tail and ran back to Russia. If they can't beat the Ukrainians, then what makes them feel like they can go up against NATO? Because NATO represents 60% of the world's military might. And there's no way that the Russian military could defeat NATO. But that's just it. That's not what they're trying to do. They're not trying to defeat NATO. What they're trying to do is drive a wedge into NATO, and they're trying to make the NATO countries start fighting with one another about what they ought to do about these kinds of incursions. Now, there was an incursion of drones, Russian drones that came out of Belarus into Poland. Since then, we've also seen drones in Lithuania and in Hungary and perhaps Romania. These drone incursions are 1s and 2s. The big one in Poland was 19 drones. And again, they're not just barely coming over the border. They're intentionally flying into NATO territory. But probing NATO airspace isn't about winning dogfights. It's about creating a narrative. Russian media frames these incursions as bold fights against the aggressor of NATO. And it shows they're telling their people this is evidence Moscow is not cowed by NATO, even while its ground forces are bleeding out in the Donbass. This feeds the myth that Russia is still a global power that's capable of intimidation of the West. It's the information battle space that is the most important. Russia understands that. NATO, not so much. NATO, for its part, has been condemning this roundly on social media, and they've called another Article 4 meeting for NATO. Article 4 means we need to get together and talk about something serious. So they're calling another meeting, and they're probably going to issue a strongly worded denunciation of this incursion into NATO airspace. And that's exactly what Russia needed to know. See, every incursion is free intelligence for Russia. By flying with their transponders off, slipping into NATO airspace, Moscow is watching how fast do NATO fighters scramble, what altitude and approach vectors are being used by the NATO aircraft that are engaging them, what are their rules of engagement, do they seem tighter or looser than the last time we did this. All that put together says this is cheap, relatively low risk intelligence gathering, and it keeps NATO guessing. It also puts psychological pressure on NATO. See, Russia knows it can't beat NATO conventionally, but it doesn't need to. The Kremlin's entire playbook is about sowing doubt in this alliance between NATO countries. If a Baltic government looks vulnerable, if NATO constituents get tired of constant headlines about scrambling to intercept the most recent incursion, if somebody in Brussels starts asking, is this really worth it to continue this war in Ukraine? That is a major win for Moscow. As a matter of fact, it might be their only chance of winning at this point. So even tiny provocations are meant to create political friction in NATO and get NATO at each other's throats. And it's working. If Russia stops fighting tomorrow, the war will be over. If Ukraine stops fighting tomorrow, Ukraine will be over. That's how you know who's the bad guy and who's the good guy. You can also look at who's committing these kinds of acts of provocation and see who the good guy is for sure. Now, Moscow is just flexing its muscles here, and it doesn't have to commit troops. It knows that NATO's not likely to shoot down these aircraft. That's exactly what should have happened. Back in 2015, a Russian fighter jet flew toward Turkish airspace, and Turkey saw them coming and reached out to them on the radio 10 times and said, you're approaching our airspace, do not cross into Turkish airspace. And the Russian plane didn't answer. 17 seconds after the Russian aircraft crossed into Turkish airspace, here's what happened.
A fighter bomber was shot down at 6,000 feet. A Turkish TV crew filmed as it fell, perfectly positioned, it seems, to ensure that the world got the message. Turkey will not accept violations of its airspace.
Turkey shot down that airplane in 17 seconds. And we just had 3 armed Russian fighter jets flying for 12 minutes inside NATO airspace. And we barely could bring ourselves to get up there and chase them out. Now, some people might wonder why they were Italian aircraft that went up to chase them out. And the answer to that is that these Baltic states don't have many aircraft of their own to be able to secure their border with Russia. Russia acted like, you've heard the argument for Putin, that he had to invade Ukraine because if not, they were going to become part of NATO, and Russia could not broker having NATO on their borders. But he's just hoping that none of you know how to read a map. Because if you look at the map, we look at the map here and we see that Russia already had borders that were along Estonia, Latvia, Poland, because of Kaliningrad right here. This is Russian territory. So there was already plenty of border territory where Russian territory was bumping up against NATO. Now, since the war began and Finland has become a NATO member, now Russia's border along NATO is about 1,000 kilometers longer, 1,200 kilometers longer. So Russia can't make the argument that, oh, we had to invade Ukraine because we couldn't handle having any border that touched NATO. And NATO is a defensive alliance. It's not an offensive alliance. So NATO was not a threat to Russia. NATO was only there to defend against Russia, right? But the bottom line is that NATO is a volunteer alliance. And if a country wants to join NATO and they meet the criteria to join NATO in terms of their military spending and their corruption or lack thereof, those kinds of things, if they meet the criteria, they can join NATO. That's how NATO works. So at this point, Russia is way ahead of NATO in terms of pushing the envelope here. Again, the question arises, why would Russia do this if they can't beat Ukraine? Why are they provoking NATO? Because they certainly can't beat NATO. But I think this may be the only way Russia can win in Ukraine, is by trying to inflict costs on NATO to get NATO to stop supporting Ukraine. Because here's what's going on. Ukraine is striking deeper and deeper into Russia. Every day, they are sending drones into Russia, sometimes missiles if it's close by, and they're striking critical infrastructure, especially their petroleum infrastructure. Every day, things like this are happening in Russia. Now, that's a Russian port, and it's one of the places where Russia transloads petroleum products onto their ghost fleet, which then gets sold to China and India and Turkey and other places like that. And so Ukraine has started hitting these sites, not just once, but again and again, just continues to hit them with their long-range drones. And it is having a major effect on Russia's ability to sell their petroleum products around the world. If we look at how deep they've been able to go inside Russia, furthest point that's been struck so far by Ukraine is Belaya. And so you see Ukraine is here. All of this is Russia. And so this is 2/3 of the way across the largest country on earth. And very soon, Ukraine will be able to strike them with much more force, because Ukraine just announced that it has completed its new ballistic missile made completely in Ukraine. It's called the Flamingo missile. This missile doesn't carry 100 pounds of explosives. It carries more like 1,000 pounds of explosives. And it will do a lot more damage. And it has pretty good range on it. So they're going to be able to really strike important places inside Russia. And Russia just is so big, it just does not have the ability to have air defenses everywhere. And Ukraine's just going to be striking. Those Flamingo missiles are going to start falling down. Some outlets are saying that this Flamingo missile could go as far as 3,000 kilometers. That's 1,800 miles. That's the headline figure you're seeing. But if that's true, that puts almost all of Russia well inside, all of first world Russia inside Ukrainian reach. The warheads, like I said, up to 1,000 kilograms, that's a ton of explosives. So a bigger warhead plus longer range means really serious changes happening in the strategy and tactics of this war. And Russia is going to start feeling the wrath of the Ukrainians. Ukraine says they can make 7 of these missiles a day. 7 a day. And this has been going on for at least several weeks. Once these Flamingo missiles start flying, they're going to do so much damage that Russia probably won't be able to fix what is broken. And so we're already seeing gas prices spike in Russia. In some places across Russia, gas is not even available. For civilians, it's very hard to get. That only stands to get a whole lot worse, because Russian refineries are right now in the time of year when they need to be transferring over from the summer blend gasoline to the winter blend heating oil. But they're not able to do that because they keep getting struck over and over again by these Ukrainian drones. Now, this is not tit for tat. The drones that are coming into Poland, Russia's not at war with Poland officially. Ukraine is at war with Russia officially, and Ukraine is not targeting civilian areas. They're not targeting apartment buildings and schools and hospitals like Russia is. They're targeting critical military and civilian infrastructure. Bottom line is, NATO has forces that are in Estonia. They're specifically to counter the threat from Russian incursions like this. And one of these days, Russia might just push too far. But the real ugly truth is that NATO leaders are acting like weenies right now. If all they do is talk about sanctions and issue strongly worded condemnations, then they lose. NATO loses. And Russia continues to press. So they started with 1 drone, 1 or 2 drones, nothing happened. We do 19 drones, nothing happened. We got a strongly worded response. Let's send some armed fighter jets with hypersonic missiles on them. So Russia is not preparing to fight NATO. Russia versus NATO would not be a match at all. Russia would lose. So Russia's not preparing for that fight. What it's preparing for is the gray zone, the space between peace and war, where a few jets here, a cyber attack there, a planted story on state TV, a bunch of social media posts that shift the narrative can change the political weather. And in that zone, Moscow thinks it has a fighting chance to win the war, because NATO's unity and political will are suspect, to say the least, especially at this point. So the provocations aren't about winning a war. They know they would lose. They're about keeping NATO nervous, and they're winning propaganda points at home and probing for cracks in the alliance. So from a Western perspective, it looks reckless, but from Moscow's perspective, it's one of the few levers of power that they can still pull without bankrupting themselves any further. And to them, they see it as tit for tat because of what Ukraine is doing, striking inside Russia. They're like, we need to start, because Ukraine is striking the source that pays for the war. That's the oil. So we need to start striking at the source of what's paying for the war in Ukraine. And that is in NATO. So I think it's very likely you're going to see more provocations by Russia. They may attack Moldova, for example, from Transnistria. What Russia's trying to do here is just drive a wedge between these NATO allies. That's all. It's big news. It's a big deal. Russia flying heavily armed fighter jets into Estonian airspace and daring NATO to do something about it. And then NATO's not really doing anything about it. So that doesn't bode well for this conflict. You could say that it's Russia acting out of desperation. They feel like this is the only card they have left to play that might actually make a difference and get the rest of NATO to stop supporting Ukraine. But Ukraine has been slowly but surely putting together its own defense industry to the point where it can defend itself. It doesn't need all the military hardware from the West. It still needs money from the West, but NATO has money. And the European Union, even if the United States stopped giving money, but we haven't, the European Union could give Ukraine most of what they need.